I'll be buried in my grave before I become a slave, yeah. That is what I heard them say way back in the day. I'll be buried in my grave before I become a slave, yeah, yeah. But it seems like since that day, yeah, we have sorely changed. I'll be buried in my grave before I become a slave, yeah, yeah. That is what I heard them say way back in the day. I'll be buried in my grave before I become a slave, yeah, yeah. But it seems like since that day, yeah, we have sorely changed. Whoa. Hey, hey. Whoa, oh, 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 whoa, oh, 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 oh.
And now, live from beautiful Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, you're watching My Fellow Americans with your host, Spike Cohen.
Yes! Yes! It's me! It's me! Keep clapping. I wasn't thinking about how dark this would be when I put it together, but keep clapping. Keep clapping for the all black on black on black miracle. How would we know that you wanted the all black miracle if you didn't keep clapping? Welcome to My Fellow Americans. I am literally Spike Cohen, and I am literally I look like a floating white head right now, and I didn't really consider that until this moment. But here we are. Folks, thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of My Fellow Americans. We're going to have a really cool conversation in just a bit. This is a pre-recorded conversation, so I will be live in the comments while you watch my... Well, it's not live. It's not live either. It's just not live. Watch my conversation with Jacob Sullum. We'll be talking about that shortly. But again, thank you so much for joining us. This is a Muddy Waters Media production. Check us out everywhere on all social media platforms, on all podcasting platforms. Join us on all of them. Go to muddywatersmedia.com. Go to anchor.fm/Muddied Waters, where you can listen to all of our episodes for podcasting, and also you can leave us questions that we will answer every single Tuesday night, except for last Tuesday because I was stuck at the airport. But most Tuesdays, if the airport lets me go home, and something else didn't come up for the Muddy Waters of Freedom, we play those. So join us. Go to muddywatersmedia.com. Subscribe to us there. Hit the bell. If you use YouTube to watch us, then hit the bell. We want your phone to blow up with notifications whenever we go live. Thank you so much. And be sure to share this right now. The last thing that I want is for you and your closest loved ones to miss out on a roughly hour-long libertarian podcast. Actually, this interview is exactly 1 hour and I believe 10 minutes or 7 minutes. I don't know. About an hour and a half total, because I'm going to be talking between it too, or before and after it. So be sure to share it right now. Give the gift of Spike today, Spike Cohen, or Spike. Give the gift of Spike Cohen today. Kids love it. This episode, of course, is brought to you by the Libertarian Party Waffle House Caucus, the fastest growing waffle-related caucus in any party ever or anything ever, because who would do that? Be sure to become a member by going to the Facebook group Libertarian Party Waffle House Caucus to become a member today. And if you want to become a duly seated and voting member, you have to get a button or a shirt. Go to muddywatersmedia.com/store and get your Libertarian Party Waffle House Caucus button or shirt today. And then you'll be able to vote, whatever that means. It doesn't mean anything. This episode is brought to you by the Gravy King, by Nug of Knowledge, smokable CBD products. Nug of Knowledge is not your everyday person selling weed on the internet because a portion of their proceeds go to help end the war on drugs. They also have a compassionate use program that donates medicinal hemp products, that's what we call it now, to veterans and people with disabilities who cannot afford these natural remedies. Many people who say that it helps with joint pain, stress relief, or a much-needed pick-me-up. If you want to do that, go to nugofknowledge.com and use checkout code SPIKE for 10% off. Joe Solosky, the key to Pennsylvania's success. Joe Solosky is running for governor of Pennsylvania as a libertarian. If you want to help him, go to Joe Solosky, JoeSoloski.com. I said that right. .com to help him in his run today. This episode is brought to you by the aptly named Mudwater. If you woke up today and said, hey, I'm sick of coffee, I want something that's got masala chai, cacao, mushrooms, turmeric, sea salt, cinnamon, and literally nothing else. Well, folks, I have some fantastic news for you. Go to muddywatersmedia.com/mud and you can buy some mud water today, and it actually doesn't taste terrible. This episode is brought to you also by, oh God, I didn't put it in the thing. Hold on. I gotta pull it up. I feel terrible. I forgot. Jack Casey is selling his books. Hopefully he's watching, and he will put the name of those books in the comments and where you can buy them. But you can buy them. Fantastic books. Look it up. Jack Casey. He has these books. One of them has a butterfly with a knife. I mean, it's a good book. That's got to be good. Jack Casey. And finally, this episode, as always, is and has been brought to you by Chris Reynolds, personal injury attorney, Chris Reynolds, attorney at law. If you find yourself personally injured in Florida, then he will sue whoever did that to you and make them pay. And I don't mean make them pay like just hold them account, but actually make them pay you real dollar bills that you can trade for Dogecoin. I don't know why. You really shouldn't. Dogecoin's a hyperinflationary. It's a meme coin. I even bought some because it just keeps going up, but it's not real, folks. Like, there's no ecosystem. It's hyperinflationary. There's no scarcity. I don't know what the hell's going on. Like, just because someone keeps tweeting about it, like, you don't have to do it. And yes, I got some too for the same reason you did. This is Tulip Mania. It's Dogecoin Mania. Personal injury attorney Chris Reynolds, attorney at law. He will not be able to sue Dogecoin for you because they've literally said that it is a joke. But he can sue anyone who damages you personally or injures you personally in Florida. ChrisReynoldsLaw.com. The intro and outro music to this. Why am I grabbing the water? That's next. The intro and outro music to this and every single freaking episode of My Fellow Americans that has ever been aired and will ever be aired comes from the amazing and talented Mr. Joe Davi. That's Jodavi. Check him out on Facebook, on SoundCloud. Go to his Bandcamp, jodavimusic.bandcamp.com. Buy his entire discography. It is amazing. It's like $25. He's got new music coming out now. He's got a new album. He's got a secret launch party that's happening in the Stockton, Lodi, California area. Go to Joe Davi's Facebook, message him, say you want to go to it, pay whatever it costs to go there. The man is a music legend, and I love him. I love you, Joe Davi. Thank you so much. I also love Le Bleu. Pure, ultra pure water. I look every time. I can't remember what kind of water it is. It's ultra pure, and I'm not doing the thing with what percentages. We've established that that's normal. The percentages of hydrogen and oxygen that are in it. It's water. Turns out there's not much deviation there. But it's very good. It's kosher. It's made in America. It's BPA free, just like me. I don't know if I have BPAs. I don't know what those are, but I am kosher. Well, actually, I'm not kosher. I am made in America, though, and I'm Jewish, but I'm not kosher, which actually makes it worse. Shout out to Tamron Turks' mom and him as always. Folks, I had a really cool guest. The interview wasn't that long ago. It was only a couple hours ago, so it's still fresh in my mind. He's an incredible guy. He's a senior editor at Reason. We had a really cool conversation about the war on drugs and his perspective on it. He has been writing about this for decades. Like his first book came out in 98, and he's been writing ever since. Senior editor at Reason, contributor to Town Hall, many other publications across the country. He's a nationally syndicated, award-winning author, and he got to speak to me, a Jew, in his guest room for an hour. What an amazing triumph for him that is. So I'm going to go ahead and play this. I will be in the comments, so don't act up. Now you can act up. I'll probably be acting up too. So I will be in the comments, so let's hang out together. And with no further ado, here is my episode, my interview with Mr. Jacob Sullum. Folks, my guest tonight is a senior editor at Reason Magazine and a nationally syndicated columnist. He's also the author of 2 critically acclaimed books, Saying Yes in Defense of Drug Use, back in 2004, and For Your Own Good, The Anti-Smoking Crusade and the Tyranny of Public Health. Ladies and gentlemen, by the way, I didn't edit this, so there might be like some spots in there that are kind of wonky. I don't think so. I think this was like a one and done number, but there might be something weird in there, so we can enjoy that together. My fellow Americans, please welcome to the show, Mr. Jacob Sullum. Jacob, thank you so much for coming on.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
I'm right off the bat had something fun happen there. I think that might have been what I was thinking of. Anyway, enjoy. I'm happy to have you on. And folks, be sure to tune in with your thoughts and questions. And Jake, actually, no, this is pre-recorded, so I will let you know in the comments if you are right or wrong. Now, Jacob, before we get started talking about all of this, I'm always interested when I see people that, you know, they're editors and authors and experts on very specific policies and specific issues. What is it that led you to, you know, really dive down and get as much expertise specifically on drug policy as it was? Was there a specific moment that something happened or sort of a gradual evolution into that type of thing? Tell us a little bit about the genesis story of what led to you becoming a nationally acclaimed author and contributor on this subject.
Well, I guess, in a way, drug policy was sort of my entree to libertarianism. Rather than the other way around. I've been interested in altered states of consciousness since I was a kid, really. I was fascinated by dreams and lucid dreaming in particular. And as I got older, I looked, there's this collection called Altered States of Consciousness edited by, I think, Charles Tart, that I probably read that in late high school or early college. And it explores the links between all these different methods that people use to change the way they perceive and think and feel. And then once I started trying drugs myself, I found that very interesting. The way their effects, how they affect different people differently. They affect the same person differently depending upon the context. What they call drug set and setting being the main factors that produce the experience. And I thought that was quite interesting just from a psychological perspective. I was a psychology major and a sociological perspective because the context really matters in terms of how people react to drugs and lots of other experiences as well. So as I was becoming interested in that, I also became aware, or pretty much was always aware, that there were laws regulating how people could change their consciousness, which always seemed insane to me. I mean, that seemed utterly arbitrary, that the government should be trying to dictate that sort of thing at all, but especially drawing really arbitrary distinctions between in the case of drugs, between the drugs that are officially approved and the ones that are prescribed. Usually with no sound scientific basis for distinguishing between these different psychoactive substances. And so I guess thinking about that made me think more broadly about what the government's proper role is, especially in terms of trying to override individual choices. And that was a big part of the push toward becoming a libertarian. and once I sort of became a professional libertarian, I found, I've been writing about this stuff for like 30 years or so now, and
Right.
and it's endlessly fascinating, really, because on the one hand, the government finds all kinds of crazy new ways to screw things up. Always new things. Always
Yes.
New unintended consequences. Although there are consequences that absolutely could have been predicted if you look at the history of drug control in the U.S. and elsewhere. But also that it touched the subject of drug use. It touches upon lots of other areas having to do with civil liberties. I mean, the most obvious civil liberties issue is control over your own mind and your own consciousness, your own body. But also it extends to freedom of speech. It extends to religious freedom. I wrote a feature years ago for Reason about religious exemptions to drug laws, which that's a challenging subject actually for a libertarian, because on the one hand, if some people don't get arrested and go to prison for this sort of thing, that's an improvement, right? But it seems suspect to give people a special status based on their religious beliefs, meaning that atheists don't get to use this psychoactive substance because they're atheists, or even people who consider themselves to be spiritual but don't belong to any kind of organized religion, they would not qualify for these exemptions. So I mean, the exemption for peyote, for example, goes back many, many years, but you've got to be a member of the Native American Church in order to legally use it. And other groups got exemptions. I guess the most familiar one being for ayahuasca, that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it wasn't based on the First Amendment. It was based on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. But the court, as I recall, it was a unanimous decision, or at least an overwhelming majority agreed that this was protected by statute, but you had to belong to one of these religious groups that treated ayahuasca as its sacrament. And so that's it's interesting to me which kinds of drug use qualified for these exceptions and which didn't. So ayahuasca, yes. Peyote for a long time. Marijuana, never.
Even though Rastafarians,
that's right. Even though Rastafarians consider it an important part of their rituals and their lifestyle, and the only reason that you can come up with for that is simply that marijuana was always way too popular. So that the worries about diversion were much greater when it came to marijuana. It's not any sound, principled reason to say Rastafarians can't have their marijuana.
Right.
It's surely because of that. Whereas the things that tended to win exemptions, things like peyote and ayahuasca, they're challenging drugs. They often make people nauseated. So if you take a drug and it makes you vomit, you have a much better chance of getting an exemption under the law, because they figure most people aren't going to be into this. And it's true, most people aren't into it, even if they don't have a negative physical reaction.
Right.
Psychedelics, especially those, are challenging, and people can have bad experiences. And if you look at the data, marijuana has always been way more popular than psychedelics.
It's also been way safer than anything else, including alcohol, which is, perfectly legal. You would think, if anything, the drug that makes you throw up would be more tightly regulated than the one that actually helps people with nausea and actually can help reduce symptoms of nausea.
Yes, I think the psychedelics like LSD are actually quite safe physically.
Right.
The main thing people worry about is that people will have bad reactions, bad trips. The more I looked into that, the more it was clear that while that's true, that depends hugely on context and expectations. And part of the reason people have bad trips is they've been told that they might have bad experiences, that it might drive them crazy, it might make them stare at the sun until they go blind,
Right.
it might make them
Right.
think they can fly and jump off a tall building. So the government's messages about these things affect the way people experience them. Even with marijuana, there was this long time idea that marijuana makes you paranoid. But it was always controversial whether that was actually a drug effect or simply the fact that you're using this illegal substance and you're a little bit worried the whole time, right?
So I'm a case study of that. So when I was when I used to do drugs, including smoking pot, I was paranoid whenever I was in a setting where there was a high likelihood of or a higher likelihood of my getting in trouble for it.
Right.
Whereas if I was somewhere where like I'm out in the woods at someone's, cabin or something like that, there's not going to be any police or anything else, and I'll be sober long before I leave. I was never paranoid. And so people would say, well, it's the drugs making you paranoid. And I'd think, no, I think it's the fear of going to jail that's making me paranoid more so than anything else.
So yeah, I mean, so the message is, this is what people like Norman Zinberg were talking about decades ago, and also Timothy Leary, that it's not just the drug. The way that people behave under the influence of a drug, the way they feel about the experience, whether they go on to become regular users, heavy users, what people would call addicts, this is all very context dependent. And the context is broadly understood to mean your own, personality, your own tastes and preferences, your own expectations, but also the broader culture, the broader social context. And it's very clear if you look at any, people's histories with any kind of drug, including alcohol, that context is really crucial. There was a great book published years ago called Drunken Comportment, where these guys, I guess they were either social psychologists or anthropologists, looked at drinking behavior across a wide range of cultures. And they found that it's not that once you drink a certain amount, you become violent, or you become friendly or whatever. There's this popular notion that it's dose specific, right? How much you drink determines whether you're having a good time, whether you're depressed, whether you're getting along with other people, whether you're getting into fights. So I think most people recognize that that's also contingent on personality, right? Some people you may know who get violent pretty often when they drink, or at least get belligerent, whereas other people don't at all, no matter the dose, right? But then the other important factor is the social context. So in cultures where people would drink as part of rituals, they could drink very large amounts and still be very well behaved and peaceful. In other cultures where it was less constrained by social convention, people would be more likely to be disorderly and to get into fights and to be violent. Even within the same culture, depending upon whether people were drinking as part of a ritual or drinking just for the hell of it, they could behave very differently on the same dose. So this, I think this is a universal truth about drugs, regardless of their legal status. And it's something you really have to keep in mind when you're trying to distinguish between the effects of drug use itself and the effects of prohibition. And prohibition makes, drug use worse and more dangerous in practically every way. Yeah. Not just that you get more paranoid when you're smoking pot, but that it actually, if people buy drugs on the black market, they just don't know what they're getting.
Right.
And you may be buying MDMA. You think you're buying MDMA, that's what they tell you it is, but you have unless you have a test kit, you don't know what's actually in there. And the best scenario is you just get ripped off and it's just had caffeine in it or something. But it could be that it's a more dangerous substance. There have been cases where people have bad reactions or even died because what they thought was MDMA was actually something else. Even more dramatically with opioids, we've seen this very clearly in the last several years. The government cracked down on pain pills, thinking, this will discourage abuse, discourage addiction, reduce opioid-related deaths.
Yeah.
And exactly the opposite happened because the non-medical users were driven into the black market. And so they're moving from products where the dosage, the potency, to ones where you buy it and you have no idea from one purchase to the next what you're actually getting. And when fentanyl was introduced as either a booster for heroin or as just an outright replacement for it, it magnified the range of potency that made the problem even worse. So the problem is not really fentanyl per se or any other drug per se. It's that people don't know what they're getting, and the potency is highly variable and unpredictable. So that policy of cracking down on pain pills to reduce opioid related deaths had just the opposite effect. And you can see that in the upward trend in opioid related deaths not only continued but accelerated. At the same time, the government was succeeding by their own standard in driving down opioid prescriptions. Of course, at the same time, you're hurting lots of legitimate patients who can no longer get the medication they need to control their pain. I mean, that's another thing I've been writing about for decades, because it's so outrageous. Because like, even if you're not worried about drug users, which I am, but some people aren't that sympathetic to recreational drug users. When you have patients who depend upon these drugs to make their lives livable, tolerable, who suddenly can't get the medication they need because somebody else, right, is abusing these drugs, I can't see how that can be morally justified from any perspective. So like I said, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, I was just going to say, on the campaign trail last year, I can't tell you how many people, it's well over a couple dozen people that I met, and they would tell me the same story over and over again, because I would always do Q&A and try to meet as many people as I could on the trail and hear their stories. And I can't tell you how many people I talked to that either they were veterans or they got in an accident or something happened where they were having a chronic pain issue, they were taking pain pills, and then one day their pain management doctor said, "You've reached your FDA limit, you can't get these pills prescribed anymore. We're going to have to start doing pain management without using them." Well, they've become dependent on them, both in terms of addiction and also in terms of needing it for their pain that has actually gotten worse over time. And so now they're having to try to get them illegally. And eventually they find out, well, for a lot less money and for a lot more easy reliability, I can just start using heroin. And some of them would even try microdosing, heroin to try to keep control of it. And the thing is, now you're using a street drug. It might have fentanyl in it. You're not going to be able to microdose long term. It's not under doctor supervision, so you're just trying to figure it out on your own. The dosages and efficacy and strengths and potencies are different from batch to batch, and you end up becoming a heroin addict. And I met people that were actively still using heroin, people that had gotten off of heroin, but it was the same story over and over again. The government helped them by telling them that they couldn't get the pain relief they needed, and they were still in chronic pain, and they needed to end up using street drugs and heroin, and including sometimes with fentanyl in it as a result of that. And one person that I spoke with who lost his brother to that chronic pain led to addiction, led to a fentanyl overdose, unintentional fentanyl overdose, and now he's not here anymore. And we can thank government for that.
So I mean, this is yet another way that the drug war invades, every aspect of life.
Yeah.
The practice of medicine. Doctors are not making decisions. Many of them are not making decisions in the best interest of their patients. They are elevating the government's demands, which translates into their own concern about getting into trouble, right, above the patient's legitimate interests and needs.
Right.
And that's, if you had told, I think this is a way that people who otherwise, support the war on drugs to really start to question it, because they never imagined.
By the way, for those who are wondering, it's been asked a few times here, you're going to be shocked to discover I am eating smoked salmon. Yeah. Yep. Okay.
It could have this sort of result. Why would it prevent legitimate use of pain medication? And yet it does. It's inevitable, because if you're determined to prevent diversion, because pain can't be objectively verified, doctors have to make a choice. They either have to trust their patients, or they have to be really suspicious of their patients. Right. And if they're really suspicious of their patients, many of them are going to be screwed, but the doctors will be safer in terms of regulators and prosecutors and police. Mm-hmm. So it's a terrible dilemma to put doctors in. I guess the other major, there's several other majors. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which the war on drugs intersects with other aspects of life. As we mentioned a few of them, but two more that we should definitely note are privacy. Search and seizure rules.
Yeah.
The war on drugs has been the main force driving the erosion of the Fourth Amendment over the past several decades. One case after another, and this actually goes back to alcohol prohibition. some of the earliest cases dealing with, when can you search someone? When can you stop them? When can you detain them? It had to do with preventing bootleggers from operating. And then that carried over into the war on drugs. And so all these protections get whittled away in the name of making it easier to enforce the drug laws. And then one other, I guess, obvious thing, or it should be obvious, is property rights. Property rights, centrally, are being denied because you're not allowed to own certain products. And if you own these prohibited products, it's taken away from you. But also indirectly through civil asset forfeiture. Even if you have not actually committed a drug crime, police can take your stuff simply by alleging that it's connected to typically drug crime, but crime in general, but
civil asset forfeiture,
and then the burden's on you to get it back, right? That's the way that works. We can talk all we want about standards of evidence and the procedures that are supposed to provide due process, but the essence of it is first they take your stuff, and now you have to try to get it back. And so they may have an innocent owner defense, which requires you to prove that you didn't know that, say your son borrowed your car and bought some pot, right? That would make your car subject to forfeiture. Now, most states at this point in the federal government have an innocent owner defense, but then you have to prove your innocence in order to recover your property, right? Insanity like that. It's like all of this flows out of the war on drugs.
Well, and no knock raids as well. You've got a legal fiction has been created. We just saw with the Breonna Taylor case. The police were not prosecuted for killing Breonna Taylor or shooting her boyfriend because they were doing a legal no knock search. Breonna Taylor's boyfriend was not arrested, was not charged or tried for shooting the police officers because they broke into their house, and he would have every reason, without knowing who it was, to fire back. This has created a legal fiction where shootouts in people's homes are legal, and it's all because of the justification of, well, if we knock, that gives them time to get rid of the evidence. It's a lot easier to conduct law enforcement in a way that comports with the Constitution and with protecting our right to due process and against unreasonable search and seizure when they're just enforcing against crimes that have actual victims. But now that they've actually banned the possession or distribution of a thing, a substance, now they're having to engage in things that blatantly violate our rights and create those kinds of disasters.
Right. So add the Second Amendment or the right to arms as to the list of casualties, because although Breonna Taylor's boyfriend was not in the end prosecuted, he was initially arrested and he was charged with attempted murder of a police officer. Had the case not gotten as much attention as it did, they might have proceeded with that prosecution. Mm-hmm. But think about what the resolution of that case implies. Is these people broke into somebody's home for no good reason. I mean, if you look at the basis for the warrant, there really was not probable cause for that warrant
at all.
Even if you accept, the drug laws as a given, it was a very shaky warrant. So they break into somebody's house in the middle of the night. They're the people who are aggressing. They're the aggressors in this situation.
Exactly.
When somebody defends himself against them, either they will arrest him and charge him with attempted murder or murder, or as in this case, they will say, no, we can understand how you misunderstood. You might have mistaken the cops for criminals. Right. No surprise, really. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's really a mistake in this context.
They're operating the same way. Exactly. They're moving the same way. Yeah.
So, but then if you say, well, he was in his rights to defend himself, you have a situation where both the cops who killed Breonna Taylor and her boyfriend, who was trying to defend her and himself against him, are somehow in the right, somehow lawfully use violence. That seems crazy, right?
Yep.
And that's a puzzle that's created entirely by laws like these. So I think Second Amendment supporters, your average NRA member should be very worried about the war on drugs because of the way it affects people's right to defend themselves. A guy may be stopped for some bogus reason or even a legitimate reason, like some minor traffic violation, and it can escalate into an armed confrontation if he happens to have a gun. Even if he's legally carrying the gun,
Yeah.
he can easily end up dead, right? That should be a concern to NRA members, and also just more generally, that anytime you create a new law and you charge police with enforcing it, you're just increasing the opportunities for potentially violent interactions.
Exactly.
We should be trying to reduce interactions between police and citizens and civilians as much as possible. And when you have a complicated system of laws like the drug laws, it just provides endless excuses for stopping people, for searching people, for arresting people, for taking people's stuff. And I think, I wish that more people on the left who tend to be against the war on drugs, and more people on the right who worry about gun rights and the right to armed self-defense, that they could see, agree on the war on about the war on drugs.
This is the same fight. Yeah.
It's the same struggle. If you're trying to defend civil liberties against an overweening government, it's important to talk about what is the government's appropriate role. What should it be doing, and what shouldn't it be doing?
Yeah, and we've talked a lot on this show with many guests, and I talked a lot on the campaign trail about the fact that the war on drugs, it's an obvious, blatant violation of our rights. As you said, our property rights, our civil rights, our bodily autonomy. It octopuses into many other things as well. It seeps into other things as well, like your right to keep and bear arms, your right to due process, all of these other things in order to enforce something that has not worked. Taking out the, as if we're talking to a non-libertarian, if we're talking to a normie about this, about why it's bad, we can just look at the consequential factors of this. It hasn't worked. Just like the war on alcohol didn't work. All it does is it creates more addicts. It creates more addiction and more overdoses, because people who have a legitimate problem, who want to get help, risk prosecution and jail time if they admit that they have problems, unless they're very wealthy and can go to some kind of resort to get their help. It leads to a black market, which empowers cartels, makes them billions of dollars. We're seeing how Central America is being completely destabilized as a result of them becoming so powerful under the guidance and support of the CIA that they're now taking over entire countries. All those people are rushing here to get away, to escape the political violence in their homelands. It's leading to all these terrible things. It's leading to corruption, more corruption in government, because those cartels pay off government officials and police officers and enforcement agents to look the other way. Often there's a lot of working directly, where this is a sponsored cartel fighting against another government-sponsored cartel. All of these things are happening as a direct result of simply the blatant violation of people's lives and rights and property. Now, one example, probably the most absurd example, all of these are bad examples. I mean, the war on drugs is a proven failure if your goal is to reduce drug use and make people safer. If your goal is to empower cartels, increase corruption, lead to more blatant violations of people's rights, and create a massive enforcement state that doesn't help anything, more gang violence and everything else, working perfectly. The war on cannabis specifically is additionally absurd, because cannabis is safer than many things that aren't even drugs. There's not a single example of a proven example, documented example of someone dying from a marijuana overdose, for example. There is a lot of data of marijuana being used for medicinal purposes. There is increasing evidence that marijuana alone typically does not impair driving enough so that it should be something that you shouldn't be able to use and drive. It is a very, very safe, as drugs go, it's about as safe as it gets, and yet it is a Schedule 1 drug, which is right up there with heroin. It is the highest level of enforcement against it. 69% of Americans support legalization. Joe Biden, during his campaign, said that anyone who has a marijuana record should be let out of jail. He promised to, quote, broadly use his clemency power for certain nonviolent and drug crimes. He has, of course, done neither. He has continued to enforce all of the tough on crime, war on drugs legislation that he championed while he was in Congress. While he was in the Senate. He continued to champion as a vice president, and he is now sitting at the top of the top throne enforcing. I know it's very early in his administration, but is Biden actually worse than Trump on cannabis?
I won't say that he's worse, but in practical terms, he has so far not been better.
Yeah.
I mean, the main issue that the Trump administration had to confront when it came to marijuana was how do we deal with all of these state legal industries, right?
Yeah.
That are in more and more states are legalizing marijuana for medical use, legalizing it for recreational use. So you have people who every day are committing federal felonies, but according to state law, they are legitimate business people paying their taxes, and to be encouraged. It's economic activity they want to encourage. They want to get
getting licenses and everything else.
Yeah. So there's this obvious untenable conflict between state and federal law. Well, the way the Obama administration addressed that was by saying this won't be a high priority for federal prosecutors,
right,
to go after state legal marijuana growers, wholesalers, and retailers, unless they're doing some other nasty stuff. And there was a list of things like selling other drugs, selling to minors, shipping across state lines, this kind of thing.
Right.
We will pretty much leave them alone. And they did, this is after a lot of hemming and hawing and a bunch of raids on medical marijuana suppliers early on. They settled on this policy, which recognize the reality that you can't put this genie back in the bottle, that states are going to do this and they're going to continue to do this. And we can't go to war with the states, and we can't enforce drug prohibition without state cooperation.
Exactly.
I mean, the states are responsible for the overwhelming majority of drug arrests, and the federal government, if no state is going to help it, the federal government can't enforce marijuana prohibition on its own. So they recognize that, but they hadn't changed the law. So they couldn't just say, we're not going to enforce this. They just made it a low enforcement priority, which meant for practical purposes, even though all of these marijuana entrepreneurs were committing felonies every day, they could be pretty confident they weren't going to get arrested, go to prison. They could be pretty confident their property wouldn't be seized, or the people that they dealt with would not have their property seized. They still had problems getting banking services, still do, because this is money laundering. If you take money from somebody who sells marijuana, even if it's legal under state law,
it's still money laundering.
Still money laundering. Yeah. And so there were some halfway assurances from regulators in the Obama administration on that score, saying to banks, well, you still have to file these activity reports. We probably won't ruin your business, and probably
throw you in prison for a RICO statute. Yeah,
impose devastating fines on you. That sort of. But that's still, there's obviously a chilling effect there, and it's still a problem. And there's a problem under federal tax law where you can under when you file your income taxes, you cannot deduct your business expenses
because they're illegal. Yeah,
right. With one bizarre exception, which is the cost of goods sold, which is the marijuana itself, that you can deduct under federal tax law. But if you buy coffee for your employees, you can't deduct that.
Can't do that. That's illegal.
Pay them salaries.
Drug outfit.
You can't deduct that. Right. So it's still quite difficult and complicated for legal reasons to operate one of these businesses, but people manage. Right. And Obama said, at least when it came to actually prosecuting them, they were pretty much going to be left alone.
Right.
And then when Trump came in with Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, the industry was worried because this guy, I don't know if you've looked at his past comments on marijuana, but he's crazy. I mean, he's an old-fashioned drug warrior, who would say things like, well, good people don't use marijuana, and it's outrageous that states are doing this. And so he made noises about a crackdown, and he actually rescinded the Obama administration memo that had said, this should be a low priority. but then basically nothing happened. So even though you had this vehemently anti-pot attorney general in charge of the Justice Department, federal prosecutors were not very interested in pursuing these cases. So that was, in practice, Trump's policy. And then when William Barr took over the Justice Department, he explicitly said, I do not plan to go after state licensed marijuana businesses. He made it clear he was not a fan of legalization, but he said this has been going on for years. There are people have reasonable expectations based on past guidance that they will be left alone. I'm not going to screw around with those investments and those expectations. But really, Congress ought to change the law so that you no longer have this conflict, if that's what Congress wants.
Right.
Right. So that was their position, and that is also the Biden administration's position. The new Attorney General, Merrick Garland, said basically the same thing. We're not going to be going after these state legal marijuana businesses. He can't make it legal. Congress has to do that, but they can hold back and not prosecute people. So in that sense, it's the same.
It's pretty much the same.
Yeah. The other ways in which Biden indicated that he would be different, he has not followed through on yet. One of the things he said was he wants to decriminalize low-level marijuana possession at the federal level, which I guess is a nice gesture. But
I was going to say, does that even matter?
No, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, because there may be the occasional marijuana user who happens to get busted and charged under federal law, but
Right.
it's a tiny share of federal cases.
Yeah.
So the practical significance of that is infinitesimal.
Yeah,
But as you might say, well, as a symbolic gesture, it's nice. And he also would expunge the records of people who have been charged with low-level marijuana possession under federal law, which again is not very many people.
But he hasn't even done that.
That's fine. He hasn't done that. The other thing he talked about was moving marijuana from Schedule 1, which means there's no accepted use at all, no accepted medical use. This is such a dangerous drug that can't even be safely used under medical supervision, which, as you point out, is absurd, because it's far less dangerous than many prescription pharmaceuticals. And it has, established medical uses. I mean, and we know this not just from crazy activists who are out there claiming that marijuana is a cure for everything, but from rigorous research. I mean, some of which convinced the FDA years ago to approve synthetic THC as a medicine. That was based on randomized clinical trials.
Right.
And so clearly it is medically useful. So it doesn't belong in Schedule 1 for that reason. And clearly it is not nearly as dangerous as many drugs in lower schedules. It doesn't belong in Schedule 1 for that reason. So he's right about that. But move it to Schedule 2, it does not accomplish much of anything in practice. It might make medical research on the medical potential of marijuana a little bit easier, because there are certain regulatory hoops you have to jump through when it comes to a Schedule 1 drug that don't apply to Schedule 2 drugs. But it would not change the treatment of marijuana growers or distributors under federal law. It would not do anything for people who are currently serving time in federal prison for marijuana offenses, including some of them serving life sentences. So it really wouldn't accomplish very much. And then the other thing he said was that he thinks medical use should be allowed. And I'm not sure if he thinks that moving marijuana to Schedule 2 would accomplish that, but it wouldn't. You still have to have products that are approved by the FDA.
By the FDA, which they won't be because they're illegal.
So it's theoretically possible. Look, they have approved a cannabis-derived drug, CBD extract,
right,
to treat some rare forms of epilepsy. So it's not like it could never happen. It can happen, but that was not legal until they approved it as a medicine. So it's simply moving it to Schedule 2 won't make it a legal medicine, let alone a legal recreational intoxicant. So I'm not sure what he imagines that would accomplish. And then the third thing he said was what you alluded to earlier, which is that he was going to broadly use his clemency powers. He suggested it would be similar to what Obama did, where he pardoned or he commuted more sentences than not just any president ever before, but than I think his previous 10 or dozen predecessors combined.
Right.
So that was a big deal, and he was very slow to start that. Those are overwhelmingly consecrated toward the end of Obama's time in office, but it did stand out compared to what other presidents had done, especially in recent years. So Biden suggested he would do that for certain nonviolent or drug offenses. I'm not sure exactly how I'd put it, but and then on at least one occasion during a debate in before he got the nomination, he said something to the effect of anybody who's in prison for marijuana should be released.
Yeah.
Now that's striking because it's not, in other words, not just low-level users. The language he used suggested that nobody should be in prison for marijuana, which implies that all of these people serving long sentences in federal prison for importing marijuana, for transporting marijuana, for growing marijuana, that they should be released. So if you combine that with his promise to use his clemency powers very broadly, it suggests that he should start doing that. He should start letting marijuana prisoners out, right? But when his press secretary was asked about this last month, she first of all said, well, he wants to reschedule it, which had absolutely nothing
to do with it. Yeah.
Nothing to do with clemency at all. But she suggested it did.
Did she circle back? Did she say she was circling back?
Well, she actually did. So the reporter who asked this is a reporter for the New York Post, Stephen Nelson, and he wouldn't let go of it. He said, well, that really isn't going to help. And, Biden is largely responsible for these policies that put these people in prison. And now, shouldn't he, now that he supposedly is a reformer, shouldn't he do something about it? And she, the first time around, she used this bogus diversion about moving marijuana to Schedule 2, which had nothing to do with the subject. The next day he asked her again, is Biden going to keep his promise to release people serving time for marijuana from federal prison? And she did not deny that Biden had made that promise. You can imagine she could say he misspoke. He didn't really mean what he said, something like it. She didn't say that.
Yeah.
He again brought up rescheduling, which still was irrelevant. And then she said, well, this is a complicated legal issue and you have to talk to the Justice Department about it. It is not a complicated legal issue.
No, it isn't.
The president very clearly has this unilateral authority to release people from prison if he thinks it's appropriate. And based on what Biden has said, he should think it's appropriate to release people who are serving time for doing things that you can earn lots of money doing now legally in 17 states if you look just at recreational marijuana, and 36 states if you include medical marijuana states. It's really outrageous. It's like after alcohol prohibition, if you left everybody who was serving time for Volstead Act violations to rot in prison. It's the same sort of thing. And all right, so we know he doesn't support legalization. His press secretary made that clear again last month because he was specifically asked, there are a couple of bills, one in the House, one in the Senate, that are coming up, and it would remove marijuana entirely from the schedules of controlled substances, not move it from 1 to 2, but meaning it would repeal the federal ban on marijuana.
Was this the MOVE Act?
The MOVE Act was one of them. That's supposed to be reintroduced. That was passed by the House last year, but it never was taken up by the Senate. And then Chuck Schumer in the Senate is promising that he's going to introduce something similar soon. So I'm not sure anything like that is going to pass the current Senate, but imagine that it did. Was the question, would Biden sign it? And she made it clear that he would not, which is, to be fair, that is consistent with the position he has taken all along. So he never said, unlike almost everybody else who ran for the Democratic presidential nomination, including his running mate, including his current vice president, he never supported repealing the federal ban. He did say states should be allowed to legalize if they want to, which again does not go any further than what Trump said and did.
In fact, correct me if I'm wrong. Did Trump not say, and maybe I'm making this up, but did he not say at one point that if legislation went to his desk that made marijuana, at least marijuana use, legal at the federal level, that he would sign that?
What he indicated a couple of times was that he would be open to signing a bill that would make an exception to federal law for state legal marijuana activity.
Okay. So if they legalize it, then it's okay.
Right. So if it's
Okay.
legal, and if what you're doing is legal under the law of your state, you won't be prosecuted under federal law for that.
Okay.
That was the basic idea, and that he seemed willing to support, at least at a couple of times. He said that. Biden has not said anything like that, as far as I know. And you can't resolve this current situation, the conflict between state and federal law, just by tinkering with the classification of marijuana. You have to remove it from the schedules entirely. So, man, I mean, it seems like this is a good opportunity for bipartisan agreement, right? You have all these Republicans and conservatives who believe in federalism and states' rights. I mean, according to the Quinnipiac University, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, poll that was conducted last month, even most Republicans now support legalization.
Yeah, a super majority of Republicans support it now too.
But even if you're a Republican who doesn't support legalization, if you're a principled constitutionalist or a principled federalist, you should say, well, states, this is something
state level. Yep.
And of course, there's the whole business angle to it, being in favor of less regulation. Republicans are supposed to be in favor of less regulation.
There's also the fiscal conservative argument. It's costing a freaking fortune running this war on cannabis, when instead tax revenue could be created for, or at the very least not be spending money on the enforcement. So it's actually a fiscally conservative position to end the war, at least on cannabis, if not the entire war on drugs as well, because it's been a proven failure. It's not helping anything, and it's just wasting well over $1 trillion at this point, and many trillions once you factor in inflation that's been spent at the federal level. So there's not really a good argument, unless you own a cartel, to continue this war on drugs, and yet Biden continues it unabated.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, well, of course, what I think should be appealing is not necessarily what members of Congress actually find appealing, but it seems to me that a very straightforward bill along the lines of what Trump said he was willing to accept, that simply said, if this conduct is legal under state law, growing marijuana, distributing marijuana, possessing marijuana, it will not violate federal law. So you carve that out of the Controlled Substances Act, and that's all it did. That would be a huge improvement over the current situation, and it conceivably could attract at least a few Republicans in both houses, which is all you would need. The problem is, judging from the MORE Act and from, I haven't seen what Schumer has in mind, but I assume that it is similar.
Right.
Democrats don't want a simple approach like that. They want to have a bill that addresses equity issues, that spends money on grants for victims of the drug war who would like to become, marijuana entrepreneurs. They want to tax it at the federal level. They want to regulate it at the federal level. And once you introduce all these elements, many of which are going to be repellent, even to Republicans who are sympathetic to marijuana reform, you've created needless division, and I think you've doomed the bill. And maybe that's fine for Democrats. Maybe they just want to be able to say, we wanted to legalize marijuana, and the Republicans wouldn't let us.
Pretty much.
But I think a cleaner approach would have better odds of passing, and Biden might even sign it. If it were, if it had bipartisan support and it basically just said what he claims to want, which is that states should be allowed to do this and the federal government shouldn't interfere. Well, it is interfering right now, even if it's not actively prosecuting people or seizing their property. Just the threat of that is actively is interfering with state decisions. So if Biden were true to his word, and he did say this on the campaign trail, and he did say this on his campaign website, that states should be free to legalize, that choice should be left up to him. If he really believed that, then he would want to eliminate this conflict between state and federal law.
Yeah. And instead, he continues to enforce his laws that he championed. He does have power to grant clemency. He's not doing that. People continue to languish in prisons on life sentences on cannabis exclusive charges. It's not like it was cannabis plus other charges. It was all related to the sale and distribution of cannabis. They are in prison for the rest of their lives unless he moves to act, or a future president does. So far, he's not indicating that, and he's actually spending more time on apparently banning menthols, which is and under the same pretense as the rest of the war on drugs, which is, this is something that's bad for your health, and therefore we're going to ban it outright, not allow you to have a choice to use it. They've even mentioned, it's very interesting, they've actually, instead of shying away from the fact that this is wildly disproportionately going to affect black consumers more so than anyone else, they're actually leaning into it and saying that's the reason that they're doing it. And they're also leaning on the fact that the Congressional Black Caucus and many other civil rights groups are championing this approach, even though those are the same people who championed when Ronald Reagan, in fact, it was actually the CBC who demanded that Ronald Reagan introduce the zero tolerance policies on crack cocaine, which led to the wild differences in sentencing between crack and powder cocaine, which led to the wildly disproportionate sentencing between black offenders and white offenders, since crack cocaine was primarily used by black people, thanks to the CIA, we now know. But as a result of all of this, and so, this, it seems like this is still moving forward. We're going to use government as a bludgeon to tell people what they can put in their bodies. And if it disproportionately harms poor people and people of color, oh well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ban on menthol cigarettes, which, to be fair, was something the FDA was talking about during the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it's an idea that's been in circulation for many years.
Right.
The premise behind it is really paternalistic. I mean, maybe that's obvious, but also really patronizing.
Yeah.
Because what it's saying is that all these black people who are buying menthol cigarettes, they may think that's what they want, but they don't really want that. It's not in their long-term interest.
Right.
And the theory with menthol is that, well, there are a couple of arguments. One is that it's more appealing to underage smokers because it's easier to smoke, it's easier to inhale and keep in, and that it encourages people to hold smoke longer, to breathe it more deeply, and therefore that it might make cigarettes more dangerous. Those are the two basic ideas.
Okay. Right.
But the whole premise is that black smokers don't know what they're doing. We have to make decisions for them. And so, like you said, on the face of it, this looks like you're targeting a product that is overwhelmingly favored by a minority group.
Yeah.
It seems like you're attacking that minority group. That's what it seems like to me,
And they've literally said, part of our reasoning behind this is that black people are using it more. I mean, they're all but saying we're creating another bludgeon for the state and its enforcement mechanism to use against them.
But the key thing is that they don't see it that way, or at least they don't describe it that way. From their perspective, they're helping black people by removing this temptation.
Yes.
And I think, a lot of them honestly believe that, right? But like I said, that's a really patronizing attitude. And it's bound. I mean, it's like they learn nothing from what went before, right?
Yeah.
If you say these products are really appealing to people, that's why we have to ban them, and you're right, then it obviously means they're gonna be black market substitutes, right? Because if there weren't much of a demand, maybe the black market problem wouldn't be that big. But your whole premise is that there's a big demand for these products that are very appealing. So that means there will be a black market supply.
Exactly.
And who is going to bear the brunt of efforts to stamp out that black market? It's going to be black people. It's going to be poor people, the same people who tend to get screwed over by the war on drugs.
Right.
So this is just adding yet another target. in the name of public health, in the name of helping the people who are actually going to be hurt by this policy. But you see that across the board. I mean, this is really just importing rhetoric from the war on illegal drugs to a new area, because look at what Biden says about drug users. Now, he used to say you have to come down hard on them, because without them, you wouldn't have a black market, which is true, by the way. It was right in that observation,
Yes.
Which makes you wonder, why do dealers get treated more severely than users?
Then
right?
the users, it's the demand, exactly.
The
Yep.
users are the one who are committing the sin, and the dealers are just helping them do it, right?
Yes.
So he used to say, back when he was a really gung-ho drug warrior, you have to crack down on users hard. You got to punish them, because without them, we wouldn't have this problem. But now he portrays users as victims. And so instead of putting them in prison, he wants to lock them up in rehab centers. Now, if you are a drug user and you get busted, depending upon like the setting of the rehab center and the specific conditions of your confinement, you might very well prefer that. So I'm not going to deny that. That might very well be better than going to prison for an individual drug user.
Right.
But what is really objectionable about it is that you're trying to pretend that punishment is treatment. It's medical treatment.
Right.
And it's treatment that you're going, unlike most kinds of medical treatment, you're going to impose it on the so-called patient, whether they want it or not, whether they need it or not, right? Because he still does not recognize a distinction between drug users in general, the overwhelming majority of whom are not addicted, the overwhelming majority of whom do not have serious problems as a result of their drug use, unless they're unlucky enough to be caught. He doesn't distinguish between them and people who really have serious drug problems. And it's the same mistake that people might make, if they ever did make this mistake, by saying all drinkers, are a problem. We need to stop.
Are alcoholic and they need to stop. Yeah.
Right. As opposed to talking about people for whom drinking is a problem and asking, well, why is it a problem? And would you like some help with that? I mean, usually people who have drinking problems are not forced into treatment unless there's some kind of criminal justice angle, like driving while intoxicated or vehicular manslaughter, right? If they mind their own business and they just drink in the privacy of their homes and they're slowly drinking themselves to death, nobody's going to force them into treatment, right? But Biden's attitude is that with illegal drug users, at least, they should be forced into treatment, and they should welcome that help, because that's what I think is appropriate, right? So it's the same kind of, paternalistic, patronizing attitude that you now see when it comes to this with the proposed ban on menthol cigarettes.
Yeah.
That it doesn't even give drug users the dignity that comes with being told, we don't like the choice you made and we're going to punish you for making that choice. Instead, they're saying it's not even a choice, right? It's a disease. You don't choose to do that. That you can't help yourself. The drug made you, right? Or the dealer made you, right?
Yeah.
You're a victim. And because you're a victim, we're going to further victimize you by locking you up in a rehab center.
Yes.
And making you meet all our demands as a condition for your freedom, right? So that's really troubling in a way that straightforward punishment is not. Like I said, it's not necessarily as bad for the individual drug user, but the message it sends is more insidious and potentially more damaging, because it makes people less sensitive to what's actually going on, right? Which is that the government is using force and violence against people who are doing nothing that justifies that.
Yeah. And in addition, it's also it's a type of treatment that no medical professional would recommend, or treatment that no medical professional would recommend, because there's all sorts of data showing that voluntary treatment is really the only, you have to have the treatment be voluntary in order for the long-term effect of someone being able to stay off of that particular drug to be able to work. Most people that are rehabbed or quote unquote detoxed or rehabbed in a prison type setting almost always end up offending, also because they're not addressing the issues that often led to that in the first place. They're just putting them in a cage like an animal and treating them like that's going to fix it. I do want to ask you this and give you the the final word on this, because I mean, being clear, the menthol ban is basically just an extension of the war on drugs. We're actually seeing an escalation of the war on drugs into a whole new front. Overall, on cannabis, on drugs, what do you think the next 4 years are going to look like? Do you think there's going to be improvement? Do you think it's going to be pretty much the status quo moving forward? Do you think it's going to get worse? I kind of leave you with the final word on this. Jacob Sullum, the floor is yours.
Well, I would say, first of all, I was very pleasantly surprised at how quickly, it may not seem quick, but how quickly pot prohibition started to crumble and continued to crumble. I didn't expect it to happen this soon. I thought probably by the time I died, it would at least begin, but the fact that, I mean, every time there are these ballot measures for voters to, say yes or no to, I'm always sure that either none of them will win or that most of them will lose, and I'm always wrong. So that's encouraging.
I'm glad you're wrong on that. We're glad you're wrong there.
But I mean, look, in this last election, every single drug policy reform measure was successful, including South Dakota, two initiatives simultaneously legalizing both medical and recreational marijuana. Who would have predicted that, right? I certainly did not predict that. That was astonishing. Now, the recreational measure is now held up in the court because the governor doesn't want to abide by the wishes of the voters. So it may not actually take effect. But the fact that voters in a red state like that were willing to approve both of these measures was very striking. And since then, all the measures that passed in November, well, New Jersey implemented their measure, the New Jersey legislature implemented it, but then separately, New York State, New Mexico, and Virginia all approved legislation. So what didn't require a ballot initiative to legalize recreational marijuana. So now we're at 17 states, 18 if you count South Dakota, which is iffy. And it's just going to continue to grow. Now that you actually have legislatures doing this, it is not dependent on the ballot initiative process anymore. So it doesn't require that the state allow, voters to change the law in that way. And so I think that's just going to continue. So that is very encouraging. And it's really just a question of when the feds are going to finally throw in the towel, because there's no going back. They will have to eventually. So that part was good. Now, my fear after this happened relates a bit to what you were saying earlier about how marijuana is so much less problematic and dangerous than other drugs.
Right.
Which is true. I mean, by important measures, it is less problematic or less dangerous than alcohol in terms of the risk of overdose. Obviously, very easy to drink yourself to death. Basically impossible to take a fatal overdose of marijuana. In terms of driving risk, I wouldn't say that there's no concern about driving under the influence of marijuana, but the research very clearly shows that it has much less dramatic effects on driving ability than alcohol does. And in terms of long-term, forget about the immediate toxic effects, but long-term effects of heavy drinking are far worse than the long-term effects of heavy cannabis use.
Right.
So by those measures, it's very, very clearly less dangerous. And so you say, why does the government make this distinction? It makes no sense, and you're right to say that. But my fear was that marijuana is a relatively easy sell, partly for those reasons, but also because so many people have tried it. And even if they didn't like it that much, they just concluded it was not as big a deal as the government was saying. With other drugs that are much less popular and potentially more dangerous. Look, opioids are potentially dangerous. Look, if you take too much of them, they can kill you, right? So we shouldn't want to deny that. But we don't want to be in a position of implying that it's only the safer drugs that should be legalized.
Right, of course.
It's precisely the most dangerous drugs that should be legalized, because banning them only makes them even more dangerous. Makes it even harder to address those hazards and try to minimize them, right? So I was a little bit, again, it's true to form. I was skeptical and I was pessimistic that the impulse to allow people to use marijuana, then allow people to supply, marijuana to cannabis consumers, that would be generalized and applied to other drugs as well. Because voters and politicians don't think very systematically, and they don't really think in terms of principles. They think, when it comes to the war on drugs, in a very drug-specific way. They were persuaded about, most Americans are now persuaded about marijuana, that it should not be banned. You cannot assume that conclusion will carry over into any other area. It's like you have to start all over again with every single substance.
Right.
So I was concerned that basically we would hit a wall after legalizing marijuana. So I was encouraged to see a few things in the last election. There were a couple of initiatives dealing with psychedelics. One of them in Oregon will actually allow the use of psilocybin at state licensed centers. You don't need a specific medical or psychiatric diagnosis. And you can use it for personal growth, for psychological issues.
Right.
It's pretty open. Of course, you still have to use it in this government licensed and approved setting, but none of the people involved are going to get arrested or, have their property seized. So that's a huge deal. That's never happened. Never happened before. Not since it's been banned has anything like that happened. Now this is going to take a couple of years to develop the regulations, so it's not happening immediately. But that was a big deal. Yeah. And meanwhile, in Washington, they passed an initiative that is broader in some ways, because it applies not just to psilocybin, but to several other plant or fungus-based psychedelics. And it does not, license distributors, but it tells police and prosecutors should leave people alone if they're using any of these substances. It includes ayahuasca, includes peyote, psilocybin, not LSD, I guess, because that's synthetic. So, but includes the natural psychedelics. And not only can people use them, but they can produce them for non-commercial purposes, share them with each other. That's a big deal, because that goes further in some ways than the Oregon measure, but also further than these other local measures that have made psilocybin specifically a low law enforcement priority. Several cities, starting with Denver, said, basically, you should leave these people alone. Don't be going after psilocybin users. But it still begged the question of, well, where do you get it from? And can people provide it? And also, it didn't actually change the penalties. It just said you should leave these people alone. But I see the willingness to approve that in a bunch of cities recently as a promising sign. Is that so? The logic that was applied to marijuana can now be extended to these drugs, which are not nearly as scary to the general public as they used to be, but are still still a minority taste. It's still something most people are not interested in using, but nevertheless, voters are willing to say, if somebody wants to do that, that's fine. Let them do that, even if it's not for me. So that's kind of a big deal, right? That they're not being necessarily self-interested about it, but they're just saying, this is not something that justifies, being arrested. Right. And then the next step after that, as with marijuana, will be, well, what about helping people do that? Why should, if the use itself is not a crime, why should aiding and abetting that behavior be treated as a crime, right? And that it took a long time for people to take that step with marijuana, because they were decriminalizing low-level possession back in the 70s. And it was, what is that? 30 or 40 years before the first dispensaries serving recreational customers actually open. I'm hoping it won't take as long with psychedelics, and Oregon's example suggests that it may not take as long. So that's promising. And then the third thing, which again, look to Oregon, they passed another ballot initiative that decriminalized low-level possession of all drugs, not just marijuana, not just psychedelics, but people who are basically possessing any drug for personal use. They're not engaged in manufacture or distribution. They won't be arrested, At most, they have a small fine. I think it's $100 fine. And the fine is waived if they agree to consult with some experts about their drug use, but that's voluntary. You can just pay the fine and be done with it. If you want to do a consultation, they're not going to force you into treatment. But the idea is that people who do have drug problems will be more likely to try to get help if they want help. And it's supposed to be, driven by what users actually want, which is really crucially important, that this not be forced on anybody.
Right.
All right. And again, that's a big deal. No jurisdiction in the United States has ever done that, has ever decriminalized drug use across the board.
Right.
So maybe that will catch on. Maybe people will see the logic that if using marijuana shouldn't be treated as a crime, if using psychedelics shouldn't be treated as a crime, maybe using these other drugs shouldn't be treated as a crime either, right? And I suspect, even if they do agree to that it'll be a long time before prohibition is actually repealed and you can actually legally obtain these drugs, for non-medical purposes. But those are some promising signs. And the marijuana thing itself is huge, and we shouldn't underestimate how huge that is. Like the day that I woke up and picked up the New York Times, probably just picked up my phone and looked at the New York Times and saw that they had an editorial saying marijuana should be legalized, I thought, maybe I've been wrong about this all these years. If the New York Times is saying it should be done, then perhaps there's something wrong with my reasoning. It was really disconcerting. and to this day, it makes me uncomfortable to have a majority view.
Libertarians are not used to everyone agreeing with us like this. No. That's not a comfortable place for us.
It really makes me uncomfortable, but of course it's very encouraging that so many people have finally come around. And like I said, the real trick is to try to get people to think in a more systematic and consistent way about these issues. It really shouldn't be that much of a leap to go from talking about marijuana use to talking about other kinds of drug use, where you can make the same points about how this should be something left to the individual. If people do have drug problems, it shouldn't be, treatment shouldn't be forced on them, but the option should be available. That prohibition creates many more problems than it solves.
Right.
It makes drug use more dangerous. Like all of these insights apply across the board to every illegal drug. So, the challenge now is to try to make that case.
Well, I hope that your skepticism continues to be proven wrong and that you will live to see an end to the war on drugs. And you're right, the step is, it's not marijuana should be legal because it's so comparatively safe and beneficial. It's marijuana should be legal, and it's ridiculous that it's illegal because of those things, but it should be legal because government involvement and prohibition on what you can and can't put in your body makes everything worse. So I hope that continues to be the trend. And Jacob, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Sure. Thank you.
That was a great interview. That guy is smart, and Jacob has been following this since, I think, before I was born or shortly after I was born. So he had a lot of really good insights there. And unfortunately, it's not a lot that we didn't know at least in general. The war on drugs is bad. It's bad because it violates our rights. It leads to bad and harmful things as a result of it. Anyone trying to claim that the war on drugs or any new things like wars on menthol or wars on any other new substances like vaping or anything like that, anyone who's trying to claim that there isn't just mountains of data showing that these types of prohibitive steps don't work, they're arguing against all available data, and yet they're the ones who are winning. Or at least their policies and ideas have been winning up until recently. Those are two very positive. That's a positive thing that we've seen, is that the people are kind of realizing, not only should we be making weed legal, not only should we be making some of these less harmful psychedelics legal, but I'm not sure government should be telling anyone what they can put in their body, and it seems like it's not really helping. Seems like it's just costing a fortune and causing even more problems as a result of it. So, folks, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of My Fellow Americans. Join me. Oh, well, first, let me tell you tomorrow on the writer's block, Matt Wright will have, who is his guest tomorrow? Let me pull this up. On the writer's block, the next guest will Joel Getz, who is running for mayor of East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. We actually had Joel on the show a couple months back on his birthday, actually. He was on to talk about it, so he's coming back on to talk about that. He's also the chair of the Monroe County Libertarian Party. He's also the social media director for Joe Solosky, who's running for Pennsylvania governor. Key to Pennsylvania success, joesolosky.com. So tune in tomorrow at 8 for the writer's block with Matt Wright and his guest Joel Getz. And then this weekend, come hang out with me in Tennessee. Friday night, I'm going to be in Murfreesboro. I don't know how to say that. I'm going to be in Emboro. I'm going to say Murfreesboro. I hope I'm saying that right. I'm going to be in Murfreesboro Friday night for a candidate training by Cell Liberty. We're going to be, or not candidate, outreach training. So Brent DeRitter, who is one of the few people that I trust to message libertarianism even better than me, is man, that sounded vain, didn't it? Even better than me. But no, he's good. He's doing an outreach training, so I'll be helping, or I'll be actually taking part in it. I'm sure he has a few things he can teach me. So you can come to that. And then Saturday morning and through Saturday, we will be doing feeding the homeless and also doing community outreach in Murfreesboro. All on Saturday with the Libertarian Party of Tennessee. So I'll be there for the whole thing. So come out and join me there. Sunday, we may be doing some additional stuff. And Saturday night, we may be doing some additional stuff elsewhere in Tennessee. More on that coming soon. So just follow my social media and I'll be updating people on what I'm doing in Tennessee. So yeah, come on out and join me this weekend and then come right back here next week. Next Tuesday for the Muddy Waters of Freedom on Tuesdays, where Matt Wright and I parse through the week's events like the sweet little 2020 Wonder Boys that we are. And then join me back here next Wednesday for my 100th episode of My Fellow Americans. I would like to thank, as always, the folks who make it possible for us to be able to, where is that? Here it is. The people that are donating to us, our monthly supporters on Float on Anchor, who are making monthly donations to help pay for all this and help make it possible for us to be able to continue to bring you the quality Muddy Waters content that you've come to know and love. Go to anchor.fm/Muddy Waters. And you can leave messages for us, and you can also donate and become a member. I'd like to thank Justin Mickelson, Jack Casey, Zachary Martin, Tim Polin, Joshua McCose, Kenneth Ebel, Sean Sparkman, James Lee, Daniel Faust, Jennifer Morrison, Jeff DePoy, Andrea O'Donnell, Chris Reynolds, Kenneth Ebel again, Jack Casey again, Meg Jones, and Billy Pierce for Texas. And folks, thank you so much for everything that you do. Thank you for being a part of this. We love you. And Patricia says, make sure you make it home next week. I will. Oh, you're saying for Muddy Waters? Yeah. Well, listen, I tried. I was stuck. This time yesterday, I was stuck in the Charlotte airport. I was supposed to get in at like 5:30, and instead I got home at midnight. And they almost tried to make it where there were going to be no flights. They got me in on literally the last minute. They were doing final boarding for the last flight to Myrtle Beach, and all the other flights for today were already booked. So it would have been Thursday. I wouldn't have waited that long. We would have just driven there. But yeah, no, I was in the airport for a very, very long time. So hopefully that doesn't happen again. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. I actually like that airport. I just had something I needed to do. So, but I'll be coming back on Monday this time. So even if I'm late, I shouldn't be so late that I miss Muddy Waters, but I probably shouldn't say that. Yeah, I know I messed up. Matt spent all this time doing a May the 4th special. I felt absolutely terrible. So my guest next week is Courtney Cahill. She is a professor, and we're going to be talking about the transgender and anti-transgender laws that are being passed. We're going to talk about it from a libertarian perspective and from a constitutional rights perspective. So whether you are in favor of some of these laws that have been coming out or whether you're against them, tune in next week right here. Same spike place, same spike time. Actually, no, regular spike place and time, 8 o'clock, not 8:30, for my guest, Courtney Cahill. And we will be talking about all things related to LGBT and trans legislation from a libertarian perspective. So, folks, thanks again for tuning in to this episode. I will see you, hopefully I will see you this weekend in Tennessee if you live anywhere near Murfreesboro. And then I will see you right back here for my fellow Americans. Thanks a lot, guys. Have a great rest of your night. I'm Spike Cohen, and you are the power. God bless, guys.
They say about an eye for an eye in a time when the blind lead the blind. Who am I to deny I would cry when a loved one dies? I recognize that body outside, but the holes in the body that was alive. Now confined to a chalk outline. Find out how, but you never know why. It ain't even make it to the news at 9. It ain't even make it to the news at 9. That's my sister, mother, father, brother, son. That's one of mine. All these years I close my eyes, open up to only find I'm in line. There's a pointless murder happening all the time. Either lose your life or mine. Caught up in them versus I. That ain't how it started, nah. How were we supposed to survive? There's a war going on outside. Who would want to raise a child? Whom the tomb is flashing by. Now you have to say goodbye when you watch them on the news at 5. Don't tell me how, tell me why.
We will make the